for inviting us to do a tutorial. So today what I would like to talk about is supply chain resilience, but really mostly focusing on one kind of a supply chain, which is our medical products and devices supply chains. And this is work, particularly the work that we do on pharmaceutical supply chains is a large group effort done by many people, as you can see with the many names that are listed there. So we've had been doing this work over 5 years with many PhD students, collaborators, interdisciplinary collaborators across departments, industry, and actually some of our PhD students had already graduated. But I just wanted to introduce everyone. And the work was supported by multiple NSF grants. So it's what I'll try to do is I'll start with a little bit generic overview on supply chain resilience, kind of blending in some of my experience at this National Academies committees on both of the National Academies committees, and then kind of move into more specific issues that I want to discuss on supply chain resilience for pharmaceutical products. So as I said, we're many people. This is who we are. So we do have, as I also said, like it's an interdisciplinary work by people, faculty and students from industrial engineering, but as well as electrical engineering, computing, psychology, and games, arts, and design. So it's really a blended group of people. Some of our students are here who's been doing this work. And I also want to say that actually Jackie Griffin is the leader of our group, and she was supposed to be here to give part of the tutorial, but unfortunately she couldn't make it. Okay. So if you look at supply chain disruptions, as like this has become a very prominent, popular area in the sense that, with the COVID particularly and with some of the recent disruptions, like we've seen very recently we've seen a baby formula shortage on the news. We've seen everyone is talking about the chips shortage, but then it's not new, right? I mean, for those of us who were working in supply chain shortages, know that these kind of shortages have existed for a very long time. Shortages due to supply chain issues have existed for a long time, such as like some of these examples here, including many shortages on pharmaceuticals, but as well as like on whipped cream, on KFC chicken, and a bunch of other things. Okay, so, but really, everything that has been happening with COVID, I think, has been really a turning point in reflecting these things on popular press, having things in New York Times, like on the cover pages of New York Times and other popular newspapers, right? So in 2020, right after the 3 big hurricanes hit the US, National Academies actually convened a committee to write a report on how the federal government can actually support support strengthening the supply chains of commercial sector. And so I was part of that committee, and we did quite a bit of work. A lot of it was kind of looking at infrastructure and other things. And then, of course, COVID hit, and as COVID hit, there were many issues around the medical product supply chain, so National Academies convened another committee, and I was part of this one as well. And what I want to talk about in the very beginning today is really a little bit of like what this committee report has said. And this committee report has actually become quite influential in the sense that we have been presenting this at the Congress, at different parts of the federal government. In fact, in a week, we have another stakeholders meeting around this where a bunch of stakeholders from both from the federal government and industry will be attending, where we will actually compare and contrast many different reports that has come out on medical product supply chain resilience issues. So I want to, as I said, I want to kind of start with a little bit on some of the the big things that this committee actually put forward in terms of supply chain resilience. So first of all, I mean, I don't really have to say to this group probably, but whenever we talk about supply chain resilience issues to a diverse group of audience, the thing we want to say is that supply chains are complex systems, right? They're multi-stage, they're usually global, there are multiple stakeholders, processes, decision-making steps, and technologies and policies, and hence, trying to understand these supply chains and make them more resilient is also a complex issue. And furthermore, even when you look at medical products, there are many different types of products. These products have, so like for example, you have drugs and medical devices. Within drugs, you have branded drugs and generic drugs. And if you look at each of these categories, they actually have very different processes, supply chains, market dynamics, pricing strategies, different types of customers. And in the US, you have all the sorts of things around insurance payments. So really, it is very, very unlikely and unrealistic to think that you will have a simple answer for supply chain resilience in such a complex market. And that's, any resilience term is going to have to be devised for the specific product. Or like, we're not just going to have one thing that covers everything, like one idea that can actually cover resilience for everything. So as I said, there's really no one-size-fits strategy. And this is actually out of my committee. This was one of the things that we really, really wanted to kind of push in terms of the result of this committee. The fact that there is not going to be one-size-fits-all solutions. And the other idea that was really big that we wanted to push is that when you look at supply chain strategies, particularly around medical products, but with other supply chains as well, sometimes there is this idea of we want to identify critical products, right? We cannot be really resilient about everything all the time. So what are, for example, the most important products that we should really, really worry about in case of a disruption? So in the medical field, there are bunch of organizations have their critical product lists, okay? However, the one thing that is really not sufficient is that those lists usually only include products that we think, or the authorities think, that they're critical to the public health, right? But no one really looks at what is the risk associated, what is the disruption risk associated with these products, right? So if you really think about any product, you really need to understand what is the risk associated with, or like what is the disruption risk associated with a product. You need to really look at how important is this product for, let's say, public health, public safety, but also you need to look at and understand the supply chain in terms of how risky it is, right? So what we're really saying, the committee really said that we really need to define this term supply chain critical medical products as those that are medically essential, but at the same time vulnerable to shortages, right? So that was like another thing that we really, really talked about in this report. We also talked about all the ways that can cause a supply chain failure. I'm not going to go through this whole thing. It's like what you expect. So you can have shortages depending on or triggering events that are on the supply side, that are on the demand side, right? On the supply side, you might have a production problem or a transportation problem. On the demand side, you might have a demand surge. I mean, obviously with COVID, we know that demand surges occur. But there is also a third category that I kind of want to emphasize, which we called, as the committee, the coordination failure. And this means that there is really enough supply to satisfy the demand at the time. But what is really happening is that there is some kind of an issue which prevents the matching of the supply to the demand, right? And this issue could be on the communication side, it could be on potential transportation side. With the COVID, we've seen that there are a lot of global political issues that, like, one country might go very protective on on its products with an anticipation of what might be happening in the future. So there's also like issues around coordination of the supply and the demand around the supply chain, which is usually global. So this is a slide that I stole from Noah, sitting there. And I just wanted to show you, like, since I'm talking about medical supply chains and product shortages, I want to kind of show you that this is real. So this is a slide that actually Noah prepared based on a bunch of our discussions, weekly discussions with a very large hospital system in Massachusetts. And this reports the number of products that are under shortage between May 2020 and January 2022, okay? And the top line is the total. And as you can see, and you might be surprised, but that line like starts around 400, ends around 600, right? So this is a lot of drugs that are on shortages that are being reported by just this one medical system, okay? It is an epidemic in the US, but I also interact with the with kind of a parallel group in Europe, and it's really an epidemic in EU too, and there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of work in EU also trying to actually. You have a question? I'm done. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Yeah, just a question on this graph. So if it's reported by a particular hospital system, how would you differentiate between a stock out and a shortage?
It's a good point. I mean, basically a shortage we define. It's a murky definition, right? And so there is also a lot of data, and I don't know if I have it on this slide, said that we look at the FDA reports or like the reports that are being collected by the Utah, by a group in Utah. But here, it's really the hospital that's telling us that it's not it's not available. They've put in an order and it's not coming, right? So it's not really a shortage. And I'm actually going to show a little bit more information around the hospital's interaction with their distributors and their manufacturers. It's a very good question. But really all of this is like they've already put in orders, there was an expected resupply date, and it has passed and it's not come. Okay, and then they're running out of products. Okay. All right. So the committee, again, I'm briefly going to just talk about the resilience framework that the committee came up with, and then I want to kind of go into more specifics around what we think as our group at Northeastern. So, so this is like, you can think about this as a general resilience framework where you have this triggering event. You know, it could be a demand surge, it can be a capacity reduction, whatever. There is like a trigger. But that trigger doesn't have to cause a shortage, right? It's like something happened, but if you're a resilient supply chain, you might really just, the customer or the patients doesn't have to know about it at all, right? So there are really different categories of resilience strategies that one can build, starting from mitigation, which is really like you might think about having diversified suppliers, right? Or hardening your production facilities, making them more quality assured, you know, things like that. So, so when a triggering event happens, the ball doesn't really have to go through the shield. But then some of these balls, I mean, none of these shields are going to be 100% secure. But so like some things are going to go through, and then, but then if we're prepared, such as if we have enough stockpiling, if we have enough capacity buffering, meaning that, okay, we don't have enough inventory, but we can actually switch over production from one line to another and start production really quickly later on, we might actually still prevent this event to become a shortage, right? But then none of the things that you can, I mean, no matter whatever you do, right, you cannot be prepared 100% of the time. So there will actually be some shortages. But then, even when we have shortages, there is also a bunch of things that we can do as a response, right? So a shortage occurred, but now we're responding to an event, such as like we can think about switching over different products. We can talk about some demand reduction techniques and many other things that is discussed in this report. But like the whole point is a shortage doesn't have to harm the patient or the customer, right? So there are really a bunch of things we can do along the way to reduce the impact on the patients or reduce the impact on the customers, okay? However, what I would like to kind of focus today's talk or this tutorial is kind of this bottom level, which is called awareness. So the biggest thing that came out of this National Academies Committee and something that we have been discussing with the industry in our group is that the awareness measure. And what that really means is the following. In the pharmaceutical sector, but in also many other sectors, there is really a lack of information sharing within the different players. I mean, obviously supply chains are made up of many different stakeholders. However, we don't really know what the supply chain is. We don't know its footprint. We don't know product flows on the supply chain. We don't know where the raw materials, the APIs are coming from. And if you don't know, you cannot really be resilient, right? You cannot make something resilient if you don't really know the critical information about that. So in this, within this committee, there has been a lot of recommendations around awareness in terms of information sharing, but also the fact that information sharing is not just enough, right? Like you can have information, but you need to really convert that into intelligible, actionable items. So there are a lot of recommendations around how to, with whom the information should be shared. That information should be taken and turned into intelligible, actionable items through analytics, decision support, and then there should be transparency so that those issues are actually shared between regulators, manufacturers, distributors, hospital systems, and so on. Okay? So that's kind of the framework, and I'm really going to take this awareness measure at the bottom and kind of say like, this is why we do this research, and this is like why this is important. So just looking at the time, I'm maybe going to go more quickly in the following slides. The only other thing I want to really show is that, again, this idea of there is, like every product or every groups of product will need a different set of supply chain resiliency actions, and usually the resilience actions that you want to choose for a given type of product should be a function of the impact of the disruption and the likelihood of the disruption, right? So the way, like, should you more concentrate on readiness and response versus physical buffers really depends on how risky your product is, but also what would be the impact of that disruption, okay? So and these I'm not going to really go through a lot, but these are again like the measures or recommendations in each area that came out of the National Academies report. And these are all, I mean, they can all be read in the report, but the report is actually very long, but there are a bunch of other communication tools that we have created that kind of summarizes the report. So there are like a lot of things around awareness, but these are things that I talked about, right? Is transparency, analysis of what is like all of the data, and communicating what came out to the required parties. The mitigation measures, preparedness measures, response measures, but I want to kind of come to the more specific part of the talk. And so from now on, I'm really going to focus on the pharmaceutical supply chains. And we've already discussed the fact that, these shortages result from a bunch of different triggering events, such as natural disasters, manufacturer inspections that go bad, right? Like quality issues, and then demand surges, and so on. Of course, the one thing that we know is that in this group, right, like we might have, I mean, this is kind of a supply chain representation, right? We have manufacturers, wholesalers, health centers. On the other hand, I mean, in pharmaceuticals, actually the supply chain starts way over here with active pharmaceutical ingredients that are raw materials and other things, and they usually come outside of this country. It's really a complex network. But what we want to say here is that once a triggering event happens on one node of the the network, of course we know that it's going to kind of propagate throughout the network. And that makes it so like you really have to think about the resilience at different stakeholders and how one disruption kind of propagates and shows itself in other places. So the one thing that we really want to, so I talked about the information sharing aspect. The other thing that I really want to talk about is the fact that the stakeholders in the supply chain, at each level, and even within one echelon, right, they make different decisions. They follow different policies. And furthermore, actually, the decisions each stakeholder at an echelon makes is different in normal times versus when there is a disruption, right? So kind of trying to make decisions to be resilient or to optimize your outcomes, let's say, is different in an environment where you have multiple stakeholders that are really kind of making different types of decisions under different policies, and the decisions really do change after a disruptive event is hard, right? So for example, the manufacturers, of course, procure raw materials, they make their production decisions, they do inventory decisions, and then they sell their products to wholesalers. However, when there is a shortage, they have to do all of those decisions, but they have to also, like, let's say if there's a disruption at the manufacturer actually has to decide if it's going to give this information of like the disruption out into its like customers or into FDA, right? When they give the information about disruption, they also have to decide if they're going to say, like, what is really the characteristics of this disruption, how long they think it's going to take, how much of their production is going to be affected. They don't really say all of that, right? They're making and every manufacturer makes a different decision about how much information to share. They also usually implement these protective allocations, meaning that now all of a sudden I don't send your order, like to my customers, I don't send everything, but I start like putting a limit. And they will decide on different types of policies, like do I have a preferred wholesaler or do I have a preferred health system, and maybe I start sending more to them or allocating more of my inventory or limited inventory to a preferred customer than doing, let's say, a proportional or equal allocation, right? They make all these kinds of decisions, and based on our, I don't know, almost 10 years of, not 10 years, but about half a dozen years of experience in this area, we know that all these manufacturers and all these wholesalers make different decisions all the time, and it's very, very hard to kind of really negotiate what to do, especially under a disruptive environment. So wholesalers also made their, they order from the manufacturers, they make inventory decisions, and then they also have to decide on how much to send to the health centers, especially under disruptive environments. And then with the health centers, again, they order, they have to do their own inventory management, they have to choose their suppliers, right? And there's also a lot of issues around how often should you switch your suppliers, like should you diversify, usually health centers have kind of a primary, secondary, tertiary suppliers, and they have to decide how much to order from each of those suppliers, because in the sense that, like I know, like the hospital system we work with, they really worry about putting in a lot of orders, even if they don't need it, because they want to keep their, place in the queue, and they want to be like an important customer to this wholesaler. So they really try to make things, like there are a lot of gaming aspects that are happening. And then for the health centers, under a disruptive environment, they also have to then deal with the clinicians, and they have to kind of talk to them in terms of, when do you actually switch a product, right? Like you wait and wait and wait, and you think that this product is going to come in, but then at one point you have to start making clinical decisions in terms of, okay, we need to switch, or we need to like kind of bring all these smaller bags and mix them and make them, or like bring big bags, open them up in our pharmacy and repackage them, which is a really expensive thing to do, right? And so there are a lot of consequences that the health centers are dealing with under a disruption environment. So let's talk a little bit about the information sharing. Obviously, information that a stakeholder gets really makes a really big difference on their decisions, right? If I know that there is a current shortage, but if my manufacturer tells me that, okay, you're going to get something in 2 weeks, like, which is really the estimated resupply date, and if I thought that that information is trustworthy, then I can really start planning around that. However, one of the issues is that this information is not really trustworthy, and it changes all the time. And hence, we're in a system where there's a lot of information, I mean, not a lot, but there is some information that is coming from the manufacturers, from the wholesalers, from direct communications around resupply dates, how much inventory is in the system, what are the other hospitals doing, are they experiencing something else, what's going on the other side of the country, what is FDA saying, what is CDC saying. So there's a lot of like this information mix when there's a disruption or a shortage, but none of this information is really trustworthy, really, from the point of view of the pharmacist. And then, so it's really a hard environment to make any decisions. And then this is just like a couple of examples, but so really based on our discussions, we have observed cases where the estimated resupply date would be pushed backwards and backwards and backwards for actually almost like to a year, where you would start from like, oh, it's just 2 weeks. And then, you know, the pharmacists will look at and say, like, we have enough inventory for 2 weeks, right? And then a week later, it will become 3 weeks. A week later, it will become 2 weeks. A week later, 5 weeks. I mean, like, it just kind of really oscillates. And actually, we have collected a lot of anecdotal data and reported data with, and Noah will be actually presenting about this tomorrow. And it's really amazing data to look at. It just like shows you that there is no way good decisions can be made. And then sometimes the opposite happens, right? Like the first estimated resupply date will be so late that the pharmacists will start planning on like all the response actions that they have to do. And then all of a sudden, a surprise shipment will occur literally on their doorstep, right? Like, I mean, you have no idea. And like, we've heard from our pharmacists that, oh, like this morning we had boxes, you know, it's really weird. But and when you think about this, this is a critical product to public health and public safety. Is really amazing that these things are happening. So if you look at the literature around supply chain resilience, but particularly on pharmaceutical supply chain resilience, there's quite a few publications right now that do point out to the role of information sharing, but also the issues that are like the lack of information sharing in the sector and issues around that. There is one growing stream of literature that really looks at this advanced supply information, actually advanced supply information sharing, and it's really kind of this nice literature that is looking at what are the information types that are being shared. You know, there's like different networks that they look at, like if you're in this kind of a supply chain network, and then this is the type of information you share, is it good or is it bad? What is the optimal strategy for sharing information given a network type and kind of the available information. And the conclusions that come out of this stream of literature is really the fact that kind of reinforcing what we've said before in terms of no one-size-fits-all idea, which is like in different situations, you would actually have different optimal advanced information sharing strategies that you would have to do. And actually, advanced information sharing is not always beneficial for the retailers, right? Like not for the beneficiaries. So it's, again, going back to the idea of things are complex. And I'm gonna actually show you some of our human experimental results, which kind of confirms these kind of ideas that information sharing actually for certain types of decisions, decision makers is not good. Actually, they influences them to behave badly. So think about hoarders, right? If you tell the hoarders that there might be a problem. The hoarders actually will start buying more. That will create a problem that might have not even would have existed. Okay? So kind of repeating what I just said, important issues in this role of information sharing, both in pharmaceutical supply chains, but also in general supply chains. Of course, what types of information should be shared, with whom, what level of information, when shall you do it, when shall you not do it, and then the next line, I really want to say a few words. So if you look at the pharmaceutical supply chain stakeholders, there is a big resistance to information sharing, particularly if you look at the manufacturers. They don't want to share any information, okay? And they claim that they will lose their competitive advantage. It will make the supply chains less secure because this is a critical product, and you kind of like let it known to everyone where your critical product facilities are. That's not safe. But what we counter with to those kind of claims is that there is new technology. You can actually use new technology to control information or data flows. You can decide on with whom you want to share information, how much information. I mean, I know that there are some companies who are working on blockchain type of structures in terms of facilitating these kind of secure and maybe competitively neutral, information sharing strategies. So the other part that I want to emphasize, and I've been emphasizing, is modeling the behavior, stakeholder behavior. So in operations research and operations management literature, I mean, we do have some behavioral research, right, looking at the behavior of stakeholders. However, there are some, if we really look at this literature and particularly look at it from a supply chain resilience perspective, in general, the traditional studies assume that decision makers are rational and they have an objective risk assessment, which is really problematic. And especially it's really problematic in a sector where you're dealing with medically critical or critical for public health purposes products, right? People actually risk assess the way that people do risk assessment or stakeholders do risk assessment turns to be really different. It's really not objective, right? Not only that the stakeholders are usually not rational, but we don't even know how to calculate risk objectively. So what we believe is that there should be more research on how humans or stakeholders make decisions, especially under stressed environments. And then, so one question, for example, is how can we build these realistic models in decision making? But also, how can we actually, so there are really two sides, right? One is, can we understand how the humans make decisions? Can we categorize these? Can we use human-in-the-loop simulations and experiments to actually tease out behavioral patterns under normal times and under disruptive times? But then, what can we do with that? Can we use these to build models that are more realistic? But furthermore, can we use this understanding to build models and decision support tools that will give or policies, right, that will give the right incentives to correct behavior or incentivize behavior in a way that the supply chains become more resilient? So again, just a few things about the state of the literature. If you particularly look at in the human-in-the-loop simulation environments, I mean, obviously, I'm assuming everyone knows beer game, but there are games that are built where you can actually take humans, put into into a state, make them act a certain act in place of a certain decision maker in this game. And then what we do, what the literature does is kind of analyze the behaviors that we observe throughout these simulations. So now I would like to show you briefly a research infrastructure that we have built over the last, as I said, more than half a dozen years actually, that kind of helps us evaluate issues around information sharing and behaviors. Okay, so that has been our focus. I mean, there are other things. I've done some work on looking at, for example, network structures and how do network structures impact resilience, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So the infrastructure we've built is really based on, stems from a flow simulator that's kind of in the middle that simulates the physical and the information flow within the supply chain system. And then what we do is we build different types of decision makers and plug those decision makers into the flow simulator at different stakeholder nodes and say like, okay, this decision maker, I'm going to like create a type of a decision maker that is going to make decision for this node, for this stakeholder in the simulator. And the two big ideas that we have used so far is on the left-hand side, we build these psychism decision makers, and what that means, so that's a terminology coming from our computer science psychology collaborators. And what that really means is we're going to build somewhat intelligent agents. And these intelligent agents, what they do is when they're making decisions, they're just not following, let's say, like a base stocks policy, right? What they're doing is they are cognizant of the other players in the system, and they can do forward projections. So in the sense, like they're not just making, let's say, ordering based on a base stock policy for the next period, but they're saying like, if I order this amount, what would everyone else in the system do? And they kind of propagate that for, let's say, I mean, they cannot propagate that for many different steps, right? But they do propagate it for a certain number of steps. So they're like these intelligent agents. They're really kind of solving a limited decision tree while they're making a decision. So we built an infrastructure based on this psychism idea to make these intelligent decision makers to understand, like if you were to have decision makers like this, how would they behave, or like what would be the impact on the system. But then we also have kind of this right-hand side of the infrastructure, which is we build games that we call gamettes, where we can actually plug in a human into a decision maker role. So we put the humans into these decision maker roles, and the simulator makes them play in this environment, and that way we can actually capture what the real humans are doing in these kind of different situations, okay? So that's kind of what we have been doing, and of course, the idea has been, I mean, not only we're just focused on how different types of people make different decisions, but also what is the impact of information on these different types of decision makers. So we do control for different information sharing strategies to kind of understand what's going on. So I think I've already said that. So the psychism, psychism as a decision maker is this kind of intelligent decision maker who can make forward projections and who can think about the other agents in the system. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details of some of the current results, but I just want to give you kind of a teaser result. I actually have another talk later today where I talk about these a little bit more. So we did experiments in a very simple system where we have 2 manufacturers, 2 distributors, 2 health centers. And then, like we looked at different types of disruption profiles, how long the disruption is, how severe the disruption is, and things like that. So in this constant patient demand, deterministically time, and with an assumption that our psychism agent has a perfect model of other agents, so this psychism agent or the psychism decision maker is actually knows exactly what others are doing. So some of the interesting, or like some of the research questions, for example, can be, how do behaviors of supply chain decision makers and their responsiveness to observations drive the system's instability, okay? So this is coming from the fact that, so if you're an intelligent decision maker, and if you're thinking about the fact that I am ordering, let's say a health center, right? And I'm ordering, And if I start not getting my orders fulfilled from a distributor, then I'm going to start switching, right? I'm going to start switching my orders from one distributor to another one, to potentially a competitor, right? So we have, like, one of the things that we have done was to kind of simulate this kind of behavior. And what we have seen is actually kind of, and the reason, let me actually say why we did this. The reason that we have looked at these kind of issues is because if you go to these meetings on pharmaceutical supply chain issues and shortages, you will hear the manufacturers always pointing the fingers to the wholesalers and the health centers, saying like, the reason that the manufacturers are not doing well is because the wholesalers and the health centers, they keep changing their order amounts and their suppliers. So this kind of an idea kind of replicates that. And what we have actually found, and I don't really think you're going to see, you're going to be able to see too much, but what we have seen is that it is good for, let's say, a health center or any kind of a stakeholder to make decisions based on the trust that they have for a given supplier, right? But then there is really, what is important is also how sensitive is the trust built. I mean, how sensitive is the buyer to the orders or kind of the past history, right? So what we have seen is that if the buyer is very sensitive, then for certain types of disruption profiles, the system might actually work worse for the buyer as well. So switching behavior between different suppliers, it could be good, but it could be really bad. It depends on how often do you do it, right? And it also depends on how bad the disruption is. And none of those as I said, like, I'm not going to get into this. This is like a whole different, whole research stream. But what we have seen is that the interactions are not linear, right? So, and that is the really important thing, that it is, again, we're looking at the complex systems. The disruption profile is really impacting the way that the decisions are making, the sensitivity of buyers to kind of not receiving their not receiving what their orders is really making a difference. And so one thing that we want to take away from this idea is that actually, if the manufacturers, let's say, start sharing more information on the characteristics of a disruption, that might actually regulate the way that the buyers are behaving, because there is an optimal sensitivity level of how quickly you should switch from one supplier to another. So if I know more about the disruption, maybe I can actually choose to do that optimal behavior. But if I'm completely blind to the disruption characteristic, then I'm just going to be like a chicken without a head, right? Like, I'm going to go like between this distributor and that distributor, or this manufacturer and that manufacturer, because I don't really know more. So this is how we kind of connect the stream of research to actually information sharing. Moving on, we said like, psychism is nice, but then it propagates. There's a look ahead. We assume that they know everything about the decision makers. However, obviously, does this model really describe the decision-making process of a supply chain manager? Like, really, right? The thing is, so what we have seen is that actually, some supply chain managers, especially those who are experienced, they do a lot of mental models, right? But usually these mental models are not going to be like this kind of decision trees that are propagating into the future. So, then one idea that like Min is pursuing here is really how can we actually come up with simpler models that look at the limited information that the supply chain manager have, but kind of have these simpler models mimic the actions that psychism or a more intelligent agent would be doing. So if you went to Cynthia Rudin's plenary yesterday, it was wonderful. I love her, and like she was like, so it's like kind of like that idea. I mean, psychism might be making really good decisions, or even a more complex optimization model can be making really good decisions. But the idea is, can you actually look at a more smaller data set, local information, and then come up with a much much more understandable and interpretable model or a heuristic that mimics and comes up with very similar decisions, right? Is that like, because that's more realistic. Not only that's more realistic in terms of like how stakeholders are making decisions right now, but it's also more realistic in terms of maybe you can actually have these people change their decision-making processes to these simpler things, rather than saying like every time you're making a decision, solve a dynamic program or whatever, right? So the way that we set up some of these ideas and this research stream was, use our research infrastructure, use the psychism decision maker to come up with a training set, right? You come up with a training set of bunch of decisions under these circumstances. This is how psychism made decisions. Like, collect that, and then build, using, actually, let me go to the next slide. And then, using either some learning approaches or other approaches or heuristic approaches that are based on the contextual knowledge that we have, then come up with some models that are much simpler, but we learn these models from the good decisions, but like it helps us to build a much, for example, easier heuristic approximator of this decision maker that actually Min has shown that in early experiments that has 95% agreement rate with like a much more intelligent decision maker, right? So I think this is also kind of a really interesting area of research, and Min will be talking about it tomorrow as well. So I think I've already said all the interesting things, but again, I would say maybe this is something kind of parallel to what Cynthia Rudin was talking about in machine learning and data analytics, that, I mean, we really work on these very complex problems, complex algorithms sometimes, but then is it really necessary? Can we actually, I mean, it is sometimes necessary, but sometimes not, right? Like, so we were really looking into these. And then I want to talk a little bit about the game mets. So as I said before, these are games that we have designed, a group of us have designed, where we put in the human decision maker into the simulated word. So what we have done first, of course, it was kind of validating the whole approach. So we did do a bunch of experiments with kind of a beer game type of environment, and we have observed that the humans actually behave very similar to observed behaviors from the past, like kind of creating the bullwhip effect when there's a disruption and all of that. So that's kind of the validation step. And then, we wanted to kind of go back to our pharmaceutical supply chain framework. The way that we have worked was we had a supply chain manager who was playing the wholesaler. And the wholesaler is kind of interesting because the wholesaler makes decisions in terms of how much to order from a manufacturer, but it also makes decisions on how to allocate its inventory to the different health centers, right? So wholesaler is really the middleman controlling all the flow, and wholesalers ends up being really important in pharmaceutical supply chains anyway, just because they're really controlling a lot of the actions and information within the supply chain. Anyway, so our agent is a distributor, human agent, and everything is normal up to a certain week. Then there is a disruption at its manufacturer, okay? And what we do is we actually give the distributor or the human player an order suggestion based on a base stock policy. And then we also control for sharing information versus not sharing information in this setting, okay? And then, so really the key here that is really interesting, I find, is the fact that when you have humans playing different roles, first of all, what you observe is that there are different types of humans, right? Some of us, by nature, are more risk takers, for example. Some of us are much more conservative. So what we wanted to tease out from these experiments were two things. First of all, characterizing the behavior, like how many different types of people, behavior patterns do we see? But that is also hard to do. And the reason for that is because the system stimulates, or the state of the system stimulates the behavior, right? So the system and the behavior evolves together. And in those kind of situations, it is actually quite hard to analyze, different behavioral patterns as the state is changing. So what we did is we actually did three things. One is we did principal component analysis and hierarchical clustering to actually classify different states of the system and do kind of dimension reduction and things like that. Then we use hidden Markov models to classify behaviors, to identify and classify different behaviors. And then we did frequent sequence analysis that kind of pointed to us is like this kind of a behavior under this kind of a system change follow this kind of a pattern. Okay, so it's really quite a few things. And again, Omid, who's not here right now, but I think he's also giving a talk on Tuesday in a lot of details. But I just want to show you only a few things, not getting into the details. But what we could, and we have been doing these experiments for years now, collecting data. We've done the experiments with our students. We've done experiments online. We've really tapped into many different types of people in these experiments. So first, what we could see is that you can characterize the system state into stable, disruption, and recovery from the disruption. And then, more interestingly, we were really able to identify three types of behaviors among all the people that we have looked into. I mean, we have, played a game. So we have hoarders. These are these people. And the colors here indicate, blue actually indicates over-ordering over the system suggested orders. Red is not ordering as much. And then what you can see is with the hoarders, they almost never take the suggested order. Then we have reactors. They basically take the suggested order, which is yellow, until there's a disruption. Once things start going bad, then the reactors will start trying to do something that is different than the suggested order. And then you have followers who are they don't change their behavior at all, no matter what happens. There is a suggested quantity, they'll just take whatever it's this decision support or the system that is suggesting something is doing. Okay, so they're different, definitely very, very clear, different characteristics. Okay, and then what is interesting is, so now we look at different information sharing strategies. So if you look at here, on the top you have the hoarders, reactors, and followers. On the columns, the first column is no information. The second column is information sharing environment. And then the top 5 categories are the different states of the system. So again, this is quite too much to kind of internalize in a limited amount of time, but what we have seen is the following. Information sharing in general reduces deviation from order suggestion, but here's the key thing. What we have found out was that with hoarders, after a disruption occurs, information sharing will actually cause the hoarders to order much more than the suggested orders. So you actually have behavior patterns or types of people, let's say, or stakeholders, where you would actually influence in a negative way if you actually share information. Okay? And I think I've said that. Okay. And then one other thing that we have been doing is capturing the mental model development. So we use a mixed method approach. We ask actually the players late. This is something that we have been doing lately. We ask the players, like, tell us what happened, right? And then we use like contextual analysis to really kind of understand how did the players' mental models developed over the set of the, over kind of the duration of the game. And what we have really seen is that, so I think this is the most important thing, and I'll just show this. So hoarders have more perception, meaning that they kind of are aware of what's going on, but they don't really comprehend that well. And then they react or they project a lot. And reactors seem to really not have so much perception, and they're not very future thinking. They don't really, they're not really very proactive. I mean, this is, again, mixed methods. This is just like we're analyzing the text entries that we have gotten by these players. And again, there is quite a bit interesting stuff going on there. But I will spend the next maybe 5 minutes in terms of talking about some other research directions that our group is working on, but we also think are interesting, okay? So we really want to understand this estimated resupply date information and how it is actually impacting decision making, because that is really the one thing that the health centers are getting, okay? We're also interested in creating intelligent agents, maybe with learning methods, because we do want to ultimately create better decision-making support, but we also want to look at these simpler models as well, right, as I was talking. So as I was saying earlier, the graph on the left-hand side really has the how the ERDs change over time, right? And they change all the time. So the idea is not only that the ERDs change all the time, but the amount of drug is not included. So you don't like, somebody tells you that we will resupply you in 5 weeks, but they don't really tell you how much they're going to supply. And then a week later, they change that 5 weeks to 2 weeks. And a week later, they change that 2 weeks to, I don't know, 10 weeks. And so you don't know anything. So the question is, how should the pharmacists work with this information, right? And then, of course, ideas could be like, how should the pharmacists work? But also, like, should there be any incentives for the manufacturers or the distributors to obtain better information? Are really interesting research areas. So some of the things that we have been doing is, like, first, can we actually say anything about the patterns of how ERD information is passed on? And then, based on those, can we, come up with stylized models to make optimal policies for different types of ERD patterns, right? And then, of course, we can put that into the more experimental, framework where we can actually try to understand how humans make decisions. But really, the overarching goal is, can we combine these models and then really decide on what is the right information to share or to show to steer decision makers toward making better decisions. Right? Another area that one of my students is working on, who's here, is really working on like intelligent agents. And the idea is this is a complex and dynamically changing system with different information that's arriving throughout time. So one thing that you can think about naturally is then the agent should learn, right? As things are changing in this complex dynamic system, then if we can maybe put an agent in as a decision maker who is learning the system state and making decisions based on the learning, then maybe the decision making will be better. So that's kind of another area that we have been looking into, how to create these kind of agents, decision makers based on reinforcement learning approaches that can potentially then be included in decision support tools. And some of the things that we have been looking at are deep reinforcement learning, but there are issues, right? We have to investigate granularity of how much information should be shared, what should be the right learning policy, and then some of the other ideas that we've been talking about, like if there is an FDA or a CDC type of an agent that actually shares or makes suggestions, can the agent learn from that as well? And the other issue, area that I've already talked quite a bit about is these interpretable models. Can we actually come up with these simpler models that are making really good decisions, maybe similar to the decisions that the learning agents are coming up with, not just psychism agents, right? But can they be more explainable? Like, can they be can you get very similar types of outcomes by these very heuristic approaches? Okay. So I'm done. I just want to finish with one more slide, and I want to kind of bring us back into the real world. So FDA, for example, after the CARES Act, for example, asks for certain information to be shared. Okay, so one of these types of information was the drug amount reporting. So one thing is that not only we don't know the supply chain structure, but we don't even know what are the flows going between different manufacturers, distributors, and so on. So in the CARES Act that came out after COVID, there is one part of the act that asks for each drug must be reported to FDA annually on the amount of on its amount, and then there has been a lot of kind of pushback around that. The stakeholders don't want to report all this information. And if you think about it, this is just annual reporting. It should not be a big deal, right? I want to know how much flow is going through in your supply chain. So FDA is actually really, really pushing that. They're saying, like, if we have this information, like, we can analyze the global footprint, right? We can actually kind of estimate patient exposure at different locations. We can evaluate long-term supply chain vulnerabilities. So actually these 3 bullets that I got is from an FDA slide that I have seen. So FDA is actually really thinking along the same ways and really, really pushing on trying to kind of implement some of these regulatory actions that are being called for. But it is a long way. Anyway, I think given the time, I will stop here. If anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you, Ozan, for a great talk. Any questions from the audience?
Thank you. This was an amazing presentation to start the day. I have a contextual question. So, in all the work that you've done over all these years, have you differentiated between the role of a wholesaler versus a GPO, and comparing, contrasting how those two are different in the context of pharma supply chain? Because that's really the unique feature, that there are two kind of players at this mid echelon of the supply chain. They are similar, but not really, kind of a thing.
Yeah. No, we haven't done that, but I mean, there are people I don't know, maybe you're one of them, right? There are like some papers that are on looking at the particular role of the GPO and what type of a GPO, right? Like there are different like GPOs that are kind of made up of the hospital system, like, you know, there are like some benefit sharing and revenue sharing between the GPO and the hospital systems. There are some other types of GPOs. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. No, we haven't looked at it at all in this work. But I know that there is some literature who has been, there's at least one very recent paper that I just read that was looking at actually this GPO infrastructure. And I can, I don't think it's published yet, but I can probably share it with you if you want to, if you want to know that. I mean, but you are right. You're right.
Thank you so much. Again, thanks for the presentation.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. In fact, before you flash your last slide, I was actually very curious about the feasibility and to what extent centralizing the management and allocation of these critical items. So then you talk about the FDA's
I mean, FDA is not
reactions,
trying to centralize. Right? I mean, this is like obviously nothing is going to be centralized. I mean, what we're pushing for is at least there's some centralized maybe information.
Correct. So
like, I
what-
think
to
the
what
only
extent,
thing you
I
can
guess,
centralize is the information here, I think. But even that, I mean, there is so much pushback. And kind of coming back to that question earlier as well. So there has been some efforts by the, by actually, like, for example, big hospital systems, they even get together to kind of create like manufacturing, like for generic drugs, they actually create their own manufacturing system, right? Because they're so sick of like being on the shorts and like not having any control. So there are a lot of kind of movements around creating different types of actors, like on top of like these differentiations between GPOs and distributors, but now there are like different kinds of like manufacturers that are actually like not like these big drug companies, but they're actually a consortium of users who are actually, like either contracting or doing things on the manufacturing side. It's really, I mean, I think it's a very dynamic industry. It's really interesting. And there are a lot of things you can look at because there are a lot of differentiations. But we haven't looked at them. There's, I think, a lot of room to look into.
Yeah, I guess the centralization may not necessarily come from the government. It can come from other organizations
exactly,
as well.
exactly, Mabel. Yeah.
So I find the information sharing to a lot of people's behavior is quite interesting, very interesting phenomenon. Yeah. All right. Any other questions from the audience? If not, let's thank
Thank you.
Oslin again. Thank you very much.